Do the tech industry's four biggest players, Amazon, Apple, Facebook and Google, have too much power? These tech titans attended a congressional hearing last week where lawmakers tried to figure out whether they have used unfair business practices to stifle smaller competitors to maintain their monopoly of the markets. And the fact that they hold massive amounts of data on people's lives, businesses and other information that they've accumulated over the years also adds to concerns over their capacity to influence users in their favour. But at the same time, hundreds of millions of people use and benefit from these services every day. And it's unclear where we should draw the line. Today, we discuss the power of big tech companies with William E. Kovacic, Professor of Law and Policy at the George Washington University and former Chairman of the US Federal Trade Commission. How are you today, sir?
Excellent, thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. We also connect with Luigi Zingales, Finance Professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Hello, it's lovely to see you.
My pleasure.
And we're also joined by Hemant Bhargava, Technology Management Chair at the University of California, Davis. It's lovely to see you today, sir.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Well, before we go straight into the discussion, let's talk about Microsoft and its possible purchase of Chinese social media platform TikTok. So why don't we start with you, Dr. Kovacic? Is Microsoft making the right decision by expanding further into social media? It's a move that will undoubtedly add to their market power, and this does come at a time when there's a lot of concern about big tech monopolies.
There's an enormous amount of pressure in Washington today on the competition agencies to look skeptically at transactions that involve large technology companies that are thinking about buying smaller firms that might emerge as major competitors. So if they do it, they're going to get a very close look from the agency that examines this, probably the Department of Justice. So they're in for a very careful review if they decide to go ahead with a developing skepticism about whether these deals help.
And this development does come at a rather sensitive time, but President Trump wants the US Treasury to have a stake in this deal for, quote, making the deal happen. What do you make of this suggestion, and is it right for a sitting US president to be so involved in a private company's business? This question goes to any of you, really.
I'd just say that there's a general view that some national security review of the implications of mergers is appropriate, but the method of doing it, getting the dosage right, is critical. And I think for competition people, there's a great deal of apprehension when the head of state reaches directly into the transaction and seeks to micromanage what takes place. And there's a suspicion that the decision isn't being made on the merits. In general, is some national security review appropriate? Certainly. But does the head of state have to become involved in putting together the partners in the transaction and overseeing the details? I think there's a lot of anxiety about that.
And Dr. Bhargava, would you perhaps have anything to add to that? I'm curious to know what you think about Microsoft's possible purchase.
So I think from their point of view, it's absolutely wonderful. And it's probably something that's being handed on a platter to them that they would have liked to do anyway. So first of all, like you said, there were 4 companies in the defendant seat of the hearing last week, and Microsoft was not one of them, right? So they were a big giant, and certainly they are a big company now, but they are not perceived as powerful and as dangerous. So I think their acquisition of TikTok is probably not going to be looked at in a very bad light, especially because it will shift market power in social media and bring in one new player beyond the ones that already are there. And from Microsoft's point of view, I think it's critical to note that they have tried for many years to go outside the perception that they are an office work software computing company. And so the acquisition of TikTok will really get them something they've been trying to do for many, many years. And more importantly, it may create a new generation of users who, when they go into work, would be willing to use Microsoft products in the future. And that, I think for them, that is really the key thing if they were to get this company.
Right, a whole new user base, really, of the younger generation. And, well,
Absolutely.
as you just mentioned, Microsoft wasn't included in this congressional hearing that was held last week, where the chiefs of Amazon, Apple, Facebook and Google attended. And after the nearly 6-hour session, David Cicilline, chairman of the subcommittee, said that these companies today, they do exist as monopolies and some of them need to be broken up. Would you agree with that? I mean, let's go to you, Dr. Dr. Zingales?
So let me start by saying I think that these companies do have an enormous power with the data they accumulated. And I think that the move by President Trump to say that TikTok cannot operate independently in the United States because they're afraid that the Chinese would use the data is a terrible move, because it suggests that they're going to do the same with American companies. So the fact that they are afraid that the Chinese will use the data suggests that there are no shields, no protection between the private companies and the government. And if this is true in in China, it's going to be true in the United States. I think that probably the Europeans will do the same by stopping every deal or every influence and demanding to have their own companies, because I think this leads to really a segmentation of the market based on nationality. I think this is the end of globalization and the beginning of nationalism in technology.
And would you also have anything to add to that, Dr. Kovacic?
I think I think Luigi is correct that there's a good reason to be worried about high-level intervention in all of these transactions. And we're at a time when globalization has a bad name. There's a great revisiting and in many instances repudiation of assumptions that we've made for decades about the benefits of global integration. At the same time, I think there will be an awareness of the cautions that Luigi mentioned. And I would expect that given the consequences, the adverse consequences that flow from extensive intervention, that some degree of caution will set in, and that there will be a lot of policymakers who step back and say, do we want the balkanization that Luigi referred to take place? The answer will be no. So I don't think this is going to be the end of globalization. I think there'll be a rethink of this. But I accept the view that there are dangers when you start marching in this direction, you don't necessarily stop.
But with the enormous amount of data that these big tech companies are accumulating and their means to influence their users via algorithms and such, can we actually say that they are competing fairly and there shouldn't be market intervention to stop these companies from perhaps breaching the line?
I mean, I think there's been a view from the beginning of modern commerce that the commercial process does not work effectively unless buyers, users know what they're getting into. So a crucial starting point is there adequate disclosure, and do users on these systems understand what they're doing? If you decide that it's impossible for them to understand and that routine disclosures simply wash over us like so much information that we can't absorb, then you have to start thinking about whether you impose different conditions, whether you have a regulatory process that limits the way that data can be used and applied over time. But if individuals, consumers and transactions don't understand what's taking place, and they have no way to offer or withhold their consent, then a crucial condition that governs routine contracting in any number of settings is violated, and you have to rethink whether or not routine transactions are actually serving the best interests of consumers and citizens.
And when was the last time you read the terms of condition of Zoom, Skype, and Apple?
Yeah. No, but I would add that
I happen to read that stuff because of an academic's fascination with these things. So I do that. Sometimes I teach contracts law, and Luigi, that's exactly one of the questions I ask students. However, when I ask them, the answer is routinely not. So I think a fundamental question here is whether or not traditional mechanisms that rely on disclosure and then consumer action or response have to be rethought, which is why I think we're going to see more and more attention given to the idea that we create regulatory mechanisms that deal with big information services platforms and set the terms and conditions on which they operate.
And do you think
it's not only that, if your children are in high school and they have to take classes on Zoom and you have to get information from Facebook, what choice do you have? Can you not sign the contract with Facebook? No, because you don't get access to the class information. They are a monopoly. They are taking advantage of your data, and you have no choice. That's the worst forms of dictatorship.
Yeah, but I think all the concerns about data policy and data choices are valid, but that is really a separate question, which applies to all companies that operate in this information age, small companies, big companies, tech companies, non-tech companies. And it really doesn't have much to do with the issue that was at the front of the congressional hearings and about the strong power and dominance of these big tech platforms, right? I think those two have to be dealt with in a very separate way. And I think it's very important to keep in mind when you ask the question, who's complaining? Interestingly, it is not the consumers of these companies that are complaining about anything, including about data. And I can agree with Bill that maybe people are they don't know what they're doing and they should be concerned about how their data is treated. But they're certainly not complaining about Amazon or Google or Facebook exploiting market power and abusing them in any way. It's others who are complaining. And so I think that has to be taken care of separately. And then when you ask this question about should they be broken up, the question is, who has articulated what it would mean to break up Google or Amazon or Facebook or Apple? We really cannot, I don't think we can comment on whether breaking up is a good idea until we have an articulation of what that is. It geographical? Is it product-wise? We really don't. I don't think there's been a well-articulated position on that.
Herman, number one, it's not true that the two questions are separated, because when Facebook was competing with MySpace, the privacy options were much, much better. The moment it became a monopoly, the privacy option became much worse. So there is a very strong correlation between protection of consumers, including privacy, and monopoly. And so I think that's a problem number one. Problem number two, I agree that it's difficult to break up the Google searches into A to B or Z to L or whatever. But with Facebook, it's very easy. You break up WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook. Those mergers should not be allowed to begin with. Now, the investigation clearly exposed the fact that they went after competitors to kill it. It was clear from the investigation they should be broken up. The world will be a better place if they're broken up.
Well, David,
Luigi, I think the problem that you mentioned, though, exists in many ways, even if you have competition among firms to provide more information and more options with respect to privacy. We still have the question about whether those different offerings are understood by consumers and whether or not firms actually comply with them and do that. So I think we're still going to have to face at some point the question of what the default terms for the collection and use of information are, which is why I think we are probably moving in the direction of the adoption of GDPR-like rules from Europe and the development of an entirely new framework in the United States that applies to all firms, not just big tech platforms. Because the question you mentioned about how people understand and absorb information and respond to it is fundamental in a way that's important whether or not you have 2 providers, 3 providers, or 10 providers.
So what really is the mood in Washington right now? Are lawmakers really moving to regulate these companies? And really the question is, are they even controllable at this point? Is it even possible to regulate them?
Short answer to that question, I think, is yes, it is. Is there a mood to do it? The mood's changing. For me, one of the striking things about the proceedings at the hearings was that Google had no friends in the room. Certainly no friends sitting at the panel with the inquisitors who were asking them. Maybe the ranking minority member, Sensenbrenner, was somewhat sympathetic, but he wasn't very energetic in mounting a defense. There was nobody there to watch their backs and say, you didn't get a chance to answer that question. In the many times I appeared before congressional committees, we often had at the FTC somebody there who's going to protect you and say, would you like to give a fuller answer? There was none of that. Nobody had their backs. And to me, that's significant. They were getting attacked from the left, right, and in the middle, which means that you have a more receptive mood in Congress. And in the elections in November, if the Democrats take the White House and both chambers of the Congress, you have a structural condition that is much more receptive to intervention in the way these companies operate. So I think that was a telling feature of the hearings.
Well, I'm afraid this
I
is
think it depends very much on who is going to be the vice president. I think with the vice president, Kamala Harris, or a vice president, Susan Rice, Facebook has a lot of friends at the new White House. If the vice president were to be Elizabeth Warren, that would be a different story, but I don't believe that will be the case.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we'll have to wrap up the discussion, but clearly it's not a debate that's going to go away soon. But thank you so much for your incredible insights. That was Dr. William E. Kovacic, Professor of Global Competition Law and Policy at the George Washington University, and Luigi Zingales, Finance Professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and Hemant Bhargava, Technology Management Chair at the University of California, Davis. Thank you all so much for joining the programme.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with more global insights on issues making headlines. Have a good one wherever you are. Goodbye.